An Appeal to My Muslim Brothers and Sisters by Mario V. Melendez, January 13, 2015. This is Part 4. There are people who, like me, are grappling and struggling with matters of faith, and they're online firing serious salvos for reform in their religion. Google and YouTube them, and you'll find scientists, academics, writers, artists, activists, intellectuals. One is a human rights advocate, another is a feisty champion for girls' education. The former is a woman in a place where women are institutionally devalued, the latter is but a young girl in a place where girls are made to choose between illiteracy or death, and both are Nobel Peace Prize laureates. They and the rest are all devout Muslims. Also among them is the President of Egypt, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, who took it even further in an unprecedented and combative speech on New Year's Day before an audience of imams, the very guardians and defenders of Islam, at Al-Azhar University, Islam's equivalent to Catholicism's the Vatican. El-Sisi is the one I mentioned earlier who asked rhetorically if Muslims want to kill the rest of the world so they can have it all to themselves. Without mincing his words, he practically scolded the imams right in their own turf into waging no less than a religious revolution of Islam to rid it of what he describes as, quote, the kind of thinking that antagonizes the world, unquote. Let me digress here for a moment and point out that President Obama and other world leaders could follow the lead of el-Sisi in dropping their characteristic political correctness on the matter and to call it for what it is, considering the sizable law-abiding Muslim communities in their own turfs. There's a point at which political correctness becomes obscurantism, and withholding the facts necessary for an informed public opinion only makes matters worse. Besides, it doesn't make sense to call these terrorists not real Muslims, quote-unquote, which I agree they're not, and then to bend over backward giving them all the respect due to a Muslim when they're caught and detained, and even after they're convicted. Indeed, by Obama's own definition, Osama bin Laden is no Muslim, which begs the question, then what's with all the Muslim burial solemnities accorded to his remains? This is precisely the absurdity that results when rhetorics and semantics are substituted for concrete solutions to solve real problems. President el-Sisi won't have none of the niceties, and his fighting words before the Islamic clergy couldn't have been more timely, being mere days after the Sydney and Peshawar terror attacks, and before the ones in Nigeria and Paris last week. The last attack is of a particularly significant coincidence to his challenge to the imams, as he could not have hit the mark more accurately, and I'll explain. The explicit prohibition against depicting a visual image of the Prophet Muhammad, for which the French cartoonists were massacred in Paris last week, isn't even found in the Quran but in the Hadith, the body of texts from various, supposedly, authoritative sources that are supposed to fill in where the Quran is silent. And even if President el-Sisi didn't mention it by name, there's no denying he was referring to the Hadith when he said, quote, that thinking, I'm not saying religion, but thinking, that corpus of text and ideas that we have sacralized over the centuries to the point that departing from them has become almost impossible, is antagonizing the whole world, unquote. Indeed, unbeknownst to many, including even Muslims themselves, there's no universal unanimity among Islamic scholars on the reliability of the Hadith as faithful interpretation or annotation of the Quran, many of which are said to even contradict each other. In fact, there's not a shortage of scholarly literature that claims that, of the tens of thousands of Hadiths, most are of questionable origin. There might even be a chance that the prohibition on the visual depiction of Muhammad turns out to be bogus, considering that the Quran only prohibits idolatry in general and is silent on depicting his image in particular. For how else does one explain the fact that such visual depictions are not uncommon in, of all places, Iran? No one seriously thinks a Muslim, let alone a non-Muslim, could possibly be tempted to idolize a humorous cartoon drawing of the Prophet, right? Contrast that to the very realistic, idolatry-inspiring images of him as a handsome young man on postcards and posters quite commonplace in Iran, which provokes nary a squeak from fundamentalists. Double standard? Hypocrisy? Bogus hadith? Or all of the above? If it turns out that hadith is fraudulent after all, then the Muslim terrorists who massacred the cartoonists in Paris were duped, and they're not really martyrs but just plain bloodthirsty, sociopathic murderers. Worse for them, they're not bound to get their prized 72 doe-eyed virgins in paradise. Another claim so plainly phony on its face, we need no Islamic scholar to tell us so. But if you must, go ask a nerdy German scholar of Semitic languages and Islamic esoterica named Christoph Luxemburg and prepare to be shocked by his scientific research on the matter. That is, if you can find him, since he's reportedly in hiding from Muslim extremists who are not amused at the scholarly research that yielded him, suffice it to say here, and I kid you not, a very rare variety of dried, shriveled fruit. Professor Luxemburg concludes that's all martyrs are getting, not virgins. Google it! Going back to the very illustrious group of Muslims who I said earlier are grappling with matters of faith like I am, one can't help but look back at the invaluable contributions their Muslim forebears brought to civilization, from the sciences to the humanities. Too many to enumerate here, let me just mention a few. Mathematics and astronomy were largely perfected by the Islamic world during its very prolific golden age. Algebra, geometry and trigonometry, as we know them today, came from Muslim mathematicians beginning in the 9th century. Copernicus and Galileo were influenced by that era's scientific writings on heliocentrism, the very blasphemous astronomical model that turned out to be accurate. Also, had it not been for Muslim scholars who translated Greek and Roman philosophy and science into Arabic and acted as its steward, that ancient body of knowledge would have been an irretrievably lost intellectual heritage of mankind, setting back civilization as we know it by who knows how long. Centuries before Shakespeare said, "There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy," Arab thinkers were already busy solving them. Indeed, it is said that Islam's golden age began in earnest from its birth in the 7th century, predating Christianity's Age of Enlightenment by about 1,000 years and lasting 500 years longer. What accounts for the overachievement and the wide disparity is said to be what's called ijtihad, the noble Islamic tradition of critical thinking and independent reasoning codified in the Quran and found nowhere in the Bible and the Torah. Indeed, the very first word in the Quran is read. No Muslim personifies ijtihad better than Ibn Rushdi, Latin name, Averroes, an intellectual giant from 12th century Islamic Spain who could have been at home in Hellenistic Greece just as well as in Renaissance Italy, being both a peer to Aristotle as a philosopher and an equal to Leonardo da Vinci as a genius polymath. Much of the modern world's understanding of Aristotelian philosophy is owed to Rush, Dee's resurrection of it from obscurity and an almost line-by-line analysis of it. On religion, he defiantly argued that philosophy is an indispensable complement to Islam, and to understand the latter one must rigorously apply the pure logic of the former, particularly Aristotelian philosophy. He absolutely rejects the simplistic dogma that the Quran should be interpreted literally. Instead, he argues for its allegorical and philosophical interpretation to arrive at its true meaning. Ibn Rushdi would not have approved of the infamous fatwa by Ayatollah Khomeini in 1980. against the British novelist Salman Rushdie, not only because he's surnamed after him, but also because he suffered the same fate of falling out of grace with the close-minded, fundamentalist powers that be of his day, and, like Rushdie, his books were also burned. Like the proverbial prophet who's not accepted in his own land, the Islamic world turned a cold shoulder to Rushdie. He was to find more acceptance in the Judeo-Christian Western world, where he's lionized as among history. His greatest philosophers, his books having been translated into Latin, Hebrew and other languages. Due to his universal appeal, he crossed over and profoundly influenced Western thought from the 12th century onward, and is even credited for igniting the Renaissance in 14th century Italy. Incidentally, Ibn Rushdie is also considered a pioneering champion of feminism, and his exhortations of the innate strengths of women and his laments for their untapped potentials under Islam are often invoked by modern-day feminists to make their case for equal rights. This is the end of Part 4. Please click on the link on screen to Part 5, the conclusion.